Thomas Wolfe Hawthorne had always been the type of man who stood tall, both on the battlefield and in his home. A decorated soldier, his service to his country earned him medals and accolades. But it was the quiet moments with his son Nathan and the loving embrace of his wife Grace that made him feel truly victorious. He had built a life of unwavering loyalty, a fortress of honor and trust. His bond with Grace was supposed to be unbreakable, founded on years of shared dreams and whispered promises. And Steve, his best friend, was a brother in arms, someone who had stood beside him through the fiercest of battles, both literal and metaphorical. But now, as Thomas stood frozen at the threshold of his own home, the world as he knew it was crumbling. Grace and Steve stood in the living room, the air between them thick with guilt, their eyes avoiding his. It hit him like a punch to the gut, a gut-wrenching realization that shattered the world he had so carefully built. They hadn't just betrayed him. They had betrayed everything he stood for, everything they had promised to uphold. His own wife, the woman he loved, the mother of his child, had crossed a line that he could never unsee. And Steve, his trusted friend, had been the one to cross it with her. Thomas couldn't breathe. His heart was racing, his mind screaming, trying to make sense of the unspeakable. But there was no making sense of this. The sting of their betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever endured. The thought of Nathan, his innocent, trusting son, made it worse. This wasn't just about him anymore. There would be consequences, but how? And to whom? The pieces of his shattered trust fell around him like broken glass, and he knew, without a doubt, this moment would alter everything forever. Days passed, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of numbness that clung to him like a shadow. He had always prided himself on being strong, steady, a man of conviction. But now, he felt hollow, as if the core of his being had been gouged out. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief, each one crashing into the other with no space for him to catch his breath. Nathan, his bright-eyed son, had begun to sense the tension, though Thomas did his best to shield him from the truth. But how could he? How could he protect his son from something this deep, this destructive? Nathan's innocent questions, his quiet presence, only made the ache in Thomas' chest worse. How could he explain this betrayal? How could he tell his son that the two people he had trusted most in this world, his mother and his godfather, had torn apart the very fabric of their family? The weight of betrayal was not only heavy on his heart, but also on his conscience. He had always lived by a simple code: loyalty, honor, and duty. He had fought wars for his country, fought for the lives of the men beside him. And yet now, in his own home, the very things he had fought to protect had been obliterated by the ones he loved. He had trusted them, believed in them, but now the very values he held sacred seemed like an illusion, a cruel joke played at his expense. Thomas knew he had to make a choice. He would not seek revenge. He wouldn't let the darkness of his pain lead him down a path of destruction. But he also knew that Grace and Steve's actions could not go without consequence. They had broken something that could never be fixed, and that truth would have to be faced. For Nathan's sake, for his own sake, and for the sake of whatever was left of his honor, Thomas made a decision. He would ensure the consequences were clear, unavoidable, and far-reaching. The betrayal would not define him, but the response to it would reshape everything. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cold and untouched in front of him. His mind, however, was anything but still. The storm of emotions had subsided into a sharp, controlled focus. His military background had always taught him that in moments of crisis, clarity was key. His instincts now told him that this was no different. There would be no impulsive decisions, no blind rage. He had been trained to analyze, to plan, and to execute with precision, and that was exactly what he would do now. The chaos inside him had to be turned into something purposeful. His first step was to build a strategy. He had learned long ago that to confront a situation like this required more than just brute force. It demanded a calculated approach. and that's where his allies would come in. Marie was the first person Thomas thought of. She had been a trusted colleague during his time in the service, an intelligence officer with a mind as sharp as a blade. She had always been someone who saw through the noise, who could dissect a situation with surgical precision. When Thomas had reached out to her, she didn't hesitate. Marie's loyalty had never wavered, even after she left the military and moved into private consulting. He needed her expertise now more than ever. Her ability to gather information, analyze patterns, and build profiles was unrivaled. The first step in his plan would be to understand exactly what he was up against, and Marie was the one who would help him do that. Diana, on the other hand, was a journalist with a reputation for digging deep, uncovering truths that people tried to bury. Thomas had met her several years ago when her investigative work had uncovered a major corruption scandal involving some of his fellow officers. They had formed a quiet respect for one another. She wasn't just a reporter, she was someone who understood the power of information and the weight it could carry. If there was a way to expose the betrayal and hold Grace and Steve accountable, Diana would find it. Her connections in the media and access to high-level sources would be crucial for spreading the truth when the time came. The plan began to take shape, slowly but surely. Marie would first conduct a thorough investigation, examining Grace and Steve's recent actions, communications, and possible motives. Was this affair something more than just a momentary lapse of judgment? Was there a deeper betrayal at play? Thomas needed to know everything, the patterns, the lies, and the hidden corners he had never seen. He knew Grace well enough to know she wasn't someone who made impulsive decisions. There had to be a reason behind all of this, and Marie would help him uncover it. Meanwhile, Diana's role would be to gather public and media support. This wasn't about dragging the situation into a public spectacle right away. It was about positioning the truth for when the time was right. Diana had connections to influential figures, sources who could corroborate or expose the things Thomas needed to know. And when the time came, her journalistic expertise would turn the tide in his favor. She would be his amplifier when everything came to light. But above all, Thomas wasn't after vengeance. Revenge would be hollow, an emotional reaction to something that had already been done. No, what he wanted, what he needed, was justice. True justice, not driven by wrath, but by accountability. His wife and best friend had crossed a line, and they needed to understand the weight of their actions, not only to him, but to everyone they had deceived along the way. Thomas had always believed that the consequences of one's actions had a ripple effect, that what people did didn't just affect them, it affected everyone in their orbit. He had to ensure that Grace and Steve understood that, and that they would face the full weight of what they had done. He wasn't going to let them get away with it by hiding behind lies or avoiding responsibility. He would make sure they paid the price, not just for their betrayal of him, but for the damage they had done to everyone around them. The strategy wasn't about burning bridges in a fit of rage. It was about building a case, setting the stage for a reckoning that would come with undeniable force. It would take time, precision, and patience, but Thomas was more than willing to wait. He knew that the truth would eventually out, and when it did, the consequences would be as inevitable as the tide. He wasn't looking for redemption, he was looking for resolution, and he would not rest until it had been achieved. The first cracks in Grace's polished exterior began to show less than a week after Thomas set his plan in motion. It started with whispers, unseen, unnamed sources leaking carefully selected details to the press. Grace, a respected counselor and public advocate for family wellness, found herself suddenly at the center of a quiet but growing scandal. The irony was almost poetic. The same woman who had built a career on trust, healing, and emotional integrity was now being quietly accused of violating those very principles in her personal life. Her employer, a nonprofit with a zero-tolerance policy for personal misconduct that could reflect poorly on its mission, put her on indefinite leave. Not termination, not yet. But the writing was on the wall. Behind closed doors, board members murmured about inconsistencies in her story, and the donations she'd worked so hard to secure began to dwindle. Her spotless record now bore a blemish too large to ignore, and the clients who once praised her were canceling appointments in droves. Meanwhile, Steve's empire, An upscale construction firm built on reputation and personal relationships was beginning to crack. And Diana had begun feeding subtle, well-placed information to financial bloggers and local business columnists. Phrases like conflict of interest and breach of ethics began surfacing alongside Steve's name, fueled by carefully released evidence of shady contract favoritism and questions about misused company funds. His competitors, long waiting for an opportunity to undercut him, were circling like sharks. What Thomas had set into motion was more than retaliation. It was a surgical dismantling of the lives Grace and Steve had built on deception. He wasn't taking reckless swings. He was guiding every blow with intention. Like a military operation, each piece moved with quiet precision, each consequence the result of a calculated step. Marie's intel was the backbone of the operation. She had traced digital footprints, intercepted deleted messages, and retrieved financial records that pointed not just to the affair but to unethical behavior within Steve's company. Diana, with her careful wording and reputation for integrity, ensured that the story didn't come off as tabloid fodder but as a credible inquiry into personal and professional misconduct. The first article appeared on a well-regarded investigative blog. The headline was understated, but the content was damning. Questions surround public advocates' private ethics drew immediate attention, linking Grace's affair to potential manipulation in grant approvals and blurred ethical lines. The piece didn't name Thomas directly, but the subtext was clear to anyone who knew the players. It was just enough to stir the pot, to invite scrutiny. And scrutiny, Thomas knew, would do more damage than outright accusations ever could. Despite the escalating public tension, Thomas remained in the shadows. He was careful not to be seen, to let others carry the narrative while he quietly pulled the strings. He wasn't interested in grandstanding or public validation. This wasn't about proving he'd been wronged. It was about ensuring the truth came to light, and the people who had betrayed him faced the weight of their own choices. The fallout had only just begun, but the momentum was building. Grace and Steve were starting to feel it, the slow, inescapable unraveling of their facades. And Thomas? He watched from a distance, silent, steady, and resolute. Justice wasn't swift, he knew, but it was inevitable. Marie had always been meticulous, a trait that served her well in both military intelligence and her post-service career. When Thomas had asked her to dig into Steve's financial dealings, she'd approached it like a high-stakes mission. For days, she sifted through layers of documents, emails, and account transactions, connecting dots that, on the surface, seemed unrelated. But Marie wasn't one to stop when the surface had been scratched. She knew there was always more beneath. It was late one evening, well past midnight, when the breakthrough came. Marie's eyes caught an innocuous email chain, one that had seemingly slipped through the cracks of Steve's inbox. It was a series of communications with a few high-level contractors. At first glance, it looked like typical business chatter, but Marie's sharp instincts told her there was something off. As she dug deeper, she found hidden attachments, confidential contracts that had been altered to inflate costs, funneling the extra money into secret offshore accounts. It was a pattern, one that Steve had been running for years, using his position to manipulate bids and misappropriate company funds. But it wasn't just the financial fraud that stunned Marie. It was the scope. Steve had used his business empire as a front for a sophisticated web of corruption, one that reached into local government, city contracts, and even the charity organizations he had been involved with. This wasn't a few missteps. This was a full-blown criminal enterprise. Marie knew what it meant for Steve. His empire would collapse under the weight of these revelations. He had been careless, leaving just enough of a trail to expose the truth. And she was going to make sure that trail led straight into the public eye. Meanwhile, Diana's investigation had been quietly building to a crescendo. When she had received the tip-off from Marie about Steve's financial crimes, she knew it was time to strike. She'd been following the pieces of the affair carefully, laying the groundwork for an article that would be explosive but factual. The public needed to see the truth, but it had to be undeniable. Diana wrote with precision, weaving together the personal betrayal with the financial malfeasance, showcasing the full extent of the web Grace and Steve had woven. The article wasn't just a piece on the affair. It was a comprehensive investigation into the abuse of power, trust, and financial misconduct. The headline was simple: Betrayal at Every Turn. How trust was manipulated and money stolen. The article went live early in the morning, timed perfectly to make a splash in the news cycle. Diana had already lined up interviews with key whistleblowers, including several former employees of Steve's company, who had agreed to go on record about the corrupt practices they had witnessed. The story immediately gained traction, circulating across social media platforms like wildfire. By lunchtime, it had gone viral. The backlash against Grace and Steve was swift and severe. Comment sections filled with outrage and disbelief as people expressed their disgust at the betrayal and the layers of deception. Donations to Grace's nonprofit ceased entirely. Her clients, once loyal, began severing ties with her publicly, claiming they felt duped. Steve, meanwhile, faced pressure from every corner. His business partners began to distance themselves, some of them quietly exiting their roles, fearing their own involvement would come under scrutiny. From his vantage point, Thomas watched the chaos unfold with an unsettling calm. There was no joy in his satisfaction, only a quiet sense of finality. The years of loyalty he had given to Grace and Steve were now paid back in full, but he wasn't celebrating. There was no catharsis in watching his former life crumble. This wasn't a victory to be savored. It was merely the natural consequence of their actions. But the deeper Thomas observed, the more he realized how desperate his enemies were becoming. Steve tried to put on a brave face in the media, claiming the accusations were part of a smear campaign orchestrated by competitors. But his responses were erratic, laced with anger and fear. He scrambled to shut down some of his offshore accounts, transferring funds to even more obscure locations. But Marie's careful digging had already uncovered enough to implicate him in multiple criminal offenses. His frantic efforts to erase evidence only made him look guiltier. Grace, on the other hand, began to lash out in private. She attempted to use her connections in the nonprofit world to suppress the stories, reaching out to old friends in high places to bury the fallout. But it was too late. The public was no longer listening to her explanations. The media didn't care about her appeals for sympathy or forgiveness. They cared about the truth. The lies had already been exposed, and there was no going back. As the walls closed in on them, the more reckless their attempts became. Steve's business partners began to speak out, some of them hinting at their own suspicions, but not one of them could deflect the truth of the article that was now circulating through every major outlet. Grace tried to reach out to Thomas, pleading for reconciliation, for some kind of leniency. But Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. They had already sealed their own fate. For Thomas, this was not about vengeance. It was about ensuring that the truth came to light, no matter how devastating the consequences. The lies had been uncovered, the damage done. Now, all that remained was watching as the fallout played out. Grace and Steve knew they had to act quickly, but their responses were frantic and poorly executed. They turned to legal teams with a singular goal: to stop the avalanche of accusations and the media frenzy that had spiraled out of control. Grace's attorneys issued a public statement claiming that the allegations against her were false, a gross distortion of the truth orchestrated by jealous rivals and disgruntled ex-employees. They even filed a defamation lawsuit against Diana, attempting to silence the press. But the move backfired. Every attempt to control the narrative only gave more attention to the very story they were trying to suppress. Steve's response was equally misguided. He retained a high-profile PR firm, and within days the firm had a polished campaign designed to rebuild his image, portraying him as a victim of a vengeful ex-friend, a misunderstood businessman who had been betrayed by the very people he had trusted most. His social media posts became increasingly defensive, desperately trying to refocus public opinion on his legacy of hard work and charitable contributions. But the public wasn't buying it. The more he clung to his image as a victim, the more people saw the cracks in his facade. His reputation, built over years, began to crumble under the weight of his increasingly transparent attempts to manipulate the narrative. But perhaps the most ill-advised move came from Grace herself. As the pressure mounted, she made a desperate decision, one that would prove to be a fatal misstep. She attempted to flee with Nathan, taking him out of state to escape the growing public backlash and the potential legal consequences. She had planned everything meticulously. A new identity, a new life, all away from the scrutiny. But Thomas had already anticipated such a move. He had been watching, calm and composed. while the wheels of his strategy turned in the background. With the help of Marie's intelligence network, Thomas had traced Grace's movements. He knew exactly where she was headed before she even got the chance to execute her plan. His team intercepted her before she could leave the city, and by the time Grace had made it to the airport with Nathan in tow, the authorities were already waiting. Grace's attempt to flee not only failed, it exposed her further. The charges of kidnapping, however unfounded they were, only added fuel to the fire. It was another failed move, another attempt to control the narrative that only served to make her look more guilty in the eyes of the public. Through it all, Thomas remained unshaken, observing their desperate attempts from the sidelines. They were spinning their wheels, making one mistake after another. Thomas's confidence grew with every misstep they made. The chessboard was set, and his enemies were only sinking deeper into the trap he had so carefully laid. There was no joy in his victory, only a steady certainty that his actions would soon bring everything to its inevitable conclusion. Steve's financial collapse was swift and merciless. What had once been a thriving construction empire, built on a combination of skill and manipulation, now crumbled like a house of cards. Investors pulled out, partners withdrew their support, and the company's debt quickly mounted. Legal battles over misappropriated funds and fraudulent contracts consumed his remaining energy and resources. In the end, it wasn't just the business that fell, it was the entire infrastructure of his life. The grand offices, the luxury cars, the plush retreats, all of it was sold off in a fire sale as creditors took their cut. But Steve's financial ruin was only the beginning. The scandal became a permanent stain on his legacy. His name, once synonymous with success, now echoed in the public consciousness only as a cautionary tale. His competitors, who had long envied his position, pounced on the opportunity to undermine him, picking apart the last remnants of his reputation. A few months later, Steve found himself reduced to living in a modest apartment, trying to claw his way back into a world that had already moved on without him. The friends and colleagues he once had by his side now avoided him as though he carried a plague. He had lost everything, and the isolation gnawed at him. For Grace, the collapse was even more public, and far more humiliating. Her legal battles turned from bad to worse. As evidence of financial impropriety, emotional manipulation of clients, and, worst of all, the potential charges of kidnapping began to surface, the once respected counselor was forced to resign from every board, every charity, and every institution that had once embraced her. The nonprofit that had employed her, once proud of her achievements, disavowed her entirely, and several clients filed lawsuits for damages, claiming emotional and professional harm. It wasn't just her professional world that collapsed, it was her social one too. Friends who had once gathered around her in the comfortable glow of privilege now quietly stepped away. Invitations to events stopped arriving. The dinner parties, the weekends at exclusive retreats, they all became distant memories. The public disgrace was a slow burn, and as she found herself losing her social standing, Grace's attempts to justify her actions to the media only fell flat. There were no more defenders. She was alone, as the harsh reality of the consequences she had avoided for so long finally closed in. The fallout from Steve and Grace's actions wasn't confined to them alone. Their families, too, felt the repercussions. Thomas's parents, who had once been celebrated members of their social circle, found themselves ostracized by friends and peers. Invitations stopped coming. People who had once treated them with respect now avoided them like the plague, unsure if their ties to Thomas made them guilty by association. The damage to their reputation was irreversible. They had supported Grace and Steve, and that connection had turned toxic. Even Rebecca, Grace's sister, couldn't escape the fallout. Her once promising career as a designer crumbled as potential clients distanced themselves from her. She lost contracts, endorsements, and, ultimately, her standing in the elite circles she had once frequented. Her phone remained silent, the calls she used to receive replaced with the steady hum of rejection. As much as she tried to distance herself from her sister's actions, it was clear to everyone that the stench of betrayal had seeped into every part of her life. The consequences of Grace's betrayal had spread far and wide, dismantling not just the lives of those directly involved, but also those who had once stood on the fringes, too close to the fire to remain untouched. As Thomas watched it all unfold, he felt no triumph, no sense of victory. What had happened was inevitable. This was the cost of betrayal. This was the price of deceit. And finally, the world around Grace and Steve, their world, was destroyed. As the dust settled and the final pieces of Steve and Grace's world crumbled, Thomas stood at the edge of it all, watching. His enemies had been dismantled, financially, socially, and emotionally. Every calculated move he had made had borne fruit, and the consequences of their actions had played out, as he knew they would. But despite the magnitude of their destruction, Thomas felt no joy. There was no elation in seeing the downfall of the people who had once been so close to him, no sense of vindication in watching their lives unravel. In the end, it all felt hollow. What was there to celebrate when the cost had been so high? His marriage, his trust, his faith, everything had been torn apart by their betrayal. Even their ruin couldn't fill the emptiness that had settled in his chest. He had sought justice, not vengeance, and the distinction mattered. Thomas had never been driven by the need for revenge. He had been driven by the need to right the wrongs, to ensure that the truth would be heard no matter the personal cost. But now, with the dust finally settling, Thomas knew that there was only one thing that mattered: his son, Nathan. For so long, Thomas had been consumed by the need to ensure his enemies paid for what they had done. But now, as he looked at Nathan, a wave of clarity washed over him. He had to rebuild, not just his life, but their life. His son had been through enough, and it was time to focus on the future. The years ahead were not for retribution, but for healing, for guiding Nathan into the person he was meant to become. Nathan, despite everything that had happened, was strong. He had witnessed his father's journey, watched him navigate the chaos and pain with a steady resolve. And now, Thomas could see the changes in him. Nathan was becoming more like his father with every passing day, not in the sense of anger or vengeance, but in the strength of character that Thomas had always valued: loyalty, honor, resilience. As they sat together, quietly sharing dinner at the table, Thomas could see in Nathan's eyes a growing understanding of what truly mattered in life. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't revenge, and it wasn't the fleeting pleasure of watching others fall. It was standing by those who mattered, living with integrity, and always staying true to one's values. Nathan was learning that lesson just as Thomas had, and that gave him hope. With the past now behind them, Thomas set his sights on building something new, something lasting, a legacy that would belong to him and Nathan, not to the pain of betrayal or revenge. He poured his energy into growing his security consulting firm, a business rooted in the principles of loyalty, trust, and responsibility. The firm's success grew steadily, built on a reputation for being dependable, for ensuring the safety and well-being of its clients. Thomas wasn't just creating a business, he was creating a foundation for their future, one that would offer stability and a sense of purpose. His firm's clients appreciated the ethical standards that Thomas upheld, something rare in an industry where dishonesty and shortcuts often prevailed. Loyalty was more than just a word to him. It was a cornerstone of his approach. And as the firm grew, Thomas made sure to instill those same values in his employees, creating an environment where integrity mattered more than profits. Nathan, too, began to thrive in this new chapter of their lives. The peaceful routine they now enjoyed was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past, and it allowed Nathan to blossom. Thomas noticed how Nathan had started to take on more responsibility, not just at home, but in his own personal life. He was becoming more thoughtful, more deliberate in his actions, and Thomas could see the seeds of loyalty and honor taking root in his son's character. Nathan was becoming the young man Thomas had always hoped he would be, someone who valued truth and stood by those who had earned his trust. In their quiet moments together, they reflected on the road that had brought them here. There were still moments of pain, moments where the shadow of the past would briefly cloud their peace. But those moments were fewer now. Thomas had found healing in the simple act of moving forward, of creating something new from the wreckage. As they sat together side by side, Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the satisfaction of revenge. It was the satisfaction of rebuilding, of knowing that they had survived, that they had learned, and that they were now stronger for it. They were moving forward, not burdened by the past, but shaped by it in ways that made them both more resilient, more aware of the value of loyalty, and more committed to building a future grounded in the values that had always mattered most. 5 years had passed since the fall of Grace and Steve, but their actions continued to reverberate, echoing through their lives like an unshakable aftershock. Thomas, now a respected leader and mentor within the military community, had fully embraced his role as a teacher. His experiences, his triumphs, and his losses had shaped him into a figure people looked up to. His military rank had solidified, but it was his personal integrity and unwavering commitment to honor that made him a revered mentor. Standing before a new generation of cadets, Thomas addressed them with the same steady voice that had once calmed him during the darkest hours. He spoke of loyalty, not as a concept, but as a way of life. He spoke of the power of trust and how betrayal could unravel everything built on that foundation. His words resonated with the young men and women before him, many of whom had seen firsthand the consequences of deceit in their own lives. His story was one they could relate to, not just as a lesson in military strategy, but as a real-life example of the importance of ethical conduct. Betrayal, he said, looking out at the sea of cadet faces, is not just about broken relationships, it's about the destruction of trust, the corrosion of integrity. When trust is lost, everything built on it falls apart, just like a house of cards. And the consequences are far-reaching, as I have learned the hard way. The room was silent as they absorbed his words. For the cadets, Thomas's experience became a stark reminder of the long-lasting effects betrayal could have, not just on the individual, but on the larger community. And as he spoke, he knew that Grace and Steve's downfall wasn't just a personal matter, it was a lesson, one that would continue to ripple through their lives, ensuring they would never fully recover. They had built their success on deceit, and now they had nothing left. The final blow had been struck, but the effects were ongoing. Their downfall was permanent, the consequences irreversible. Thomas's approach to justice, measured, methodical, and resolute, became a case study in military strategy and corporate ethics. His ability to balance strategic thinking with personal integrity was analyzed in seminars, discussed in military classrooms, and studied by corporate leaders. His story was one of taking the high road, even when the temptation for immediate revenge loomed large. In the military world, where honor and loyalty were valued above all else, Thomas became a symbol of what it meant to maintain one's moral compass, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Nathan's life had unfolded in parallel, shaped by his father's unwavering commitment to justice. Academically gifted and driven, Nathan excelled in his studies, embodying the lessons his father had imparted. When he was accepted into the prestigious military academy, Thomas saw a reflection of his younger self in his son. It wasn't just the achievement that made Thomas proud. It was the growth Nathan had shown in character, in his understanding of loyalty, and in his ability to rise above the pain of the past. The life that Thomas had built from the ashes of betrayal was now a beacon of resilience. It stood as a symbol of honor, integrity, and the unshakable belief that truth would ultimately prevail. Thomas had not only rebuilt his own life, but had also created a legacy that would endure for generations. As time passed, Steve and Grace continued to suffer from the irreversible consequences of their actions. Steve, once a powerful figure in the business world, found himself struggling to regain any sense of credibility. His name was forever tarnished, his once glorious empire reduced to a cautionary tale. Grace, too, was left to face the fallout of her betrayal. No matter how many apologies she offered or how much she tried to rebuild her career, she was always remembered for her lies and manipulation. Neither of them could escape the past, and neither would ever recover fully from the destruction they had caused. Thomas, on the other hand, stood firm in the knowledge that justice had been served. The lessons he had imparted on loyalty and integrity had not only shaped his own life, but also the lives of those who had looked to him for guidance. His story was one of consequence, of knowing that actions have repercussions, and that the pursuit of justice is not always about swift retribution, but about the long, enduring power of truth. As he looked out at the world he had rebuilt, Thomas knew that the past had been laid to rest. There was no more need for vengeance, no more need for retribution. Justice had been delivered, and it would serve as a reminder to future generations. Betrayal may break you, but integrity and honor will always rebuild.